to find my info. Okay. I am, so my name is Pamela Butler, and I'm on the executive committee at WWN. And I am completely thrilled and excited to introduce Dr. Sonia Bansal. And I've known Sonia for, as we just said, it feels like a long time, both professionally in terms of our research and also as a fellow member of WWN. So Sonia is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, and she studies cognitive and perceptual deficits in schizophrenia. And she was born and raised in Nairobi, Kenya, and then moved to the USA, to Iowa, to do her bachelor's degree. And then she got an MS in biotechnology at Johns Hopkins, and then her PhD in neuroscience at George Mason University. And she studies predictive mechanisms related to sensory motor behavior and schizophrenia. And she's done a lot of very innovative work, including developing eye tracking and psychophysics methods to examine disturbances in visual processing and relationships to cognitive and social function. And in addition to her really amazing research, which we're going to hear about today, she's been an integral part of WWN. She is on the executive committee, and she's now the lead for the membership and outreach committee. And she also has done, at her institution, University of Maryland, she is the program director of the Etta and Meyer Dana Foundation, working with underrepresented minorities. And she also works outside of her institution as well as a mentor for a Skype A Science program, which I love the name, Skype A Science, working with classrooms and mentoring a lot of people. She's also a selected mentor at the New York Academy of Sciences Global STEM program. So without further ado, it's just been a total pleasure to get to know her and work with her and share both of our interests in schizophrenia and global outreach. Okay.
Thank you so much, Pam, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to take a second to share my slides, and then we'll jump right into it. And thank you all for attending. I look forward to some discussion. All right, hopefully everyone can see that okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about understanding some symptoms of schizophrenia, namely hallucinations and delusions, through predictive brain mechanisms. I'll give you a quick outline. So I'll mention some of the psychotic symptoms in schizophrenia, which is the primary population that I study these phenomenon in, but I do look at other spectrum type symptoms as well. For today's talk, I'm going to focus more on schizophrenia. So I'll go over some psychotic symptoms. I'll talk about the two main kind of theoretical models underlying these symptoms, and just some kind of future directions with this. All right, so for those who are unfamiliar, schizophrenia is a lifelong neuropsychiatric disorder in which patients suffer from a variety of symptoms that are generally grouped into three different types: positive, negative, and disorganized and cognitive symptoms. So I'll go over that in detail in a second. It impacts about 0.5 to 1% of the population, of the general population. And the onset of schizophrenia is usually late teens into the 20s. And as far as symptoms go, as I mentioned, it's generally grouped into those three categories, but it is very heterogeneous in its symptomatic course, and I'll touch upon that in a second. And about 75% of patients with schizophrenia have substantial functional disability over long term. So when I say functional disability, I mean things like the ability to keep a job or education, or basically general functioning in life tasks. And my focus, as I mentioned, is the positive or psychotic symptoms. These are generally treatment resistant in many patients and are associated with high levels of distress as well as functional impairment. And I'll go over some reasons why the focus on positive symptoms. So as I mentioned, these are the categories. So schizophrenia, when you initially think about it, it's most stereotypically characterized by things like false perceptions and beliefs, disorganized thought and language. And this includes things like hallucinations and delusions. It also includes agency distortions in which people have a belief that one's thoughts or actions are influenced or controlled by an external agent. So there's a strong kind of loss of agency within some of these delusions as well. And so the reason they're called positive symptoms is that they're behavioral abnormalities that are present due to the illness, such as auditory or visual hallucinations or grandiosity. And negative symptoms are behavioral abnormalities that are diminished due to the illness, such as reduced motivation, anhedonia, reduced speech, and amotivation and affective flattening as well. And then there's disorganized symptoms that are characterized by disorganized speech, bizarre behavior, and mannerisms. And some of these symptoms are partly responsive to treatment. And finally, cognitive symptoms, these are pretty wide-ranging. It includes things like reward processing, perception, attention, and working memory. And again, these symptoms most closely relate to a patient's ability to function in society and are also linked to the other two symptoms, as I'll go over shortly. So the interactions between the symptom domains of schizophrenia, as far as cognitive impairments go, this can affect things like reward and motivation in terms of the negative symptoms. And cognitive symptoms are also, cognitive systems are also implicated in perception, which then affects the positive symptoms. And that kind of feeds back into negative symptoms via things like paranoia and being socially avoidant. So all these things are pretty interlinked, but the issue at hand is that they present themselves in each individual patient in very different ways. So as I mentioned, it's a very heterogeneous disorders as far as symptom presentation goes. So some of the fundamental questions are, what are the characteristic symptoms, if any? And what are some boundaries of the concept in terms of distinguishing psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions within schizophrenia from other psychotic disorders? And is there a need to create those boundaries? So from a research perspective, some of these questions arise, and it also feeds into the diagnostic and treatment perspective as well. So I'm kind of, as you can notice, I'm kind of rushing through, but feel free to pause me if there's any questions as I go along. So as such, based on what I mentioned about symptoms, schizophrenia as such is a polythetic construct where it has many, but not all properties in common. So it affects thinking, emotion, interpersonal relationships, but there's no single characteristic symptom. So moving along, as far as the focus on positive symptoms go, is that they're generally, the mechanisms underlying some of these are pretty hard to understand as of now. The research, and based on just the wide range of symptoms seen in each individual, has been varied, mixed findings as far as mechanisms go. So a lot more work to do in this area. And these symptoms, as I mentioned, are associated with high levels of distress and impact all areas of functioning as well. So in terms of which functions within the brain, within domains of behavior affect the symptoms, as far as hallucinations go, the function that's distorted is perception. So just perceiving sensory experiences and interpreting them as hallucinations. And then as far as delusions go, it's inferential thinking. So that indicates that people who are affected by psychosis have aberrant inferences such that they make kind of bizarre or extreme connections between things and attribute meaning to things that are not as salient otherwise. And then, of course, I mentioned disorganized speech and bizarre behavior. So these affect thought and language systems as well as cognitive systems where you you are aware of and can kind of monitor your behavior. So that was an overview of general positive symptoms, kind of narrowing in on hallucinations. They occur across many sensory systems: auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory. Auditory are the most common, and the others can be linked to the auditory. Usually they do present as being kind of linked, but what I've seen in my work is that auditory is the most common, with some visual and tactile being next. And then as far as delusions go, there's delusions of paranoia or suspiciousness or persecution, where people believe that someone is out to get them or they're going to be persecuted by a government. Those are some examples. And then on the other end of things, there's also delusions like grandiosity, where people believe they're some kind of a messiah, or they have special supernatural abilities and things like that. And then there's religiosity type delusions. This one is a bit of a point of conflict or debate, just because we do see different cultures having extreme religious beliefs. So there's some cultural connotation to how we interpret these as being pathological per se. So the caution must be taken when diagnosing things diagnosing or even on the research side as far as religiosity goes. And then there's delusions of passivity, which is what I mentioned. People thinking their thoughts or actions are being controlled by an external agent. So again, to reiterate, why focus on the psychotic symptoms? So treatment has been slowed by a lack of model of how these symptoms arise and how they persist. And these symptoms are a target for better treatment development. And they can also serve as a prognostic indicator, meaning they can be predictive of the course of illness or identifying people who are at risk for developing psychosis. Psychotic symptoms are a key for that. All right, so switching gears based on the why, getting into more of the mechanistic side of things and what models exist to kind of examine this within research settings. So prominent mechanistic models of schizophrenia consider the brain to be a prediction machine that sustains and updates a model of kind of the structure of the environment, and it uses that along with sensory input to make sense of the world. So basically, using regularities from experience, matching that up with new incoming sensory input, that's how we form a stable perception of the world around us. So as such, the brain is considered to be an inference or prediction machine. So based on that idea of the brain functioning as a prediction machine, there's two theoretical models of the origins of psychotic symptoms and why these abnormal perceptions arise. So there's an impaired corollary discharge account, which I'll get into shortly, and the predictive coding account. I will start with the predictive coding account. So this is one of the leading frameworks, and it's within this framework, perception is considered to be a form of inference where we perceive, act, and believe based on our prior experiences. And then we update those priors in light of incoming data. So psychotic symptoms are, under this framework, thought to result from aberrant predictive coding mechanisms. So specifically, hallucinations and delusions are thought to form and be maintained by abnormalities in neural and cognitive processes that underlie perception, action, and belief formation. And so these psychotic symptoms can be explained by overweighing priors relative to sensory information, leading to false perceptions. So here's an example of a strong prior. So I'm going to give a sound that hopefully you will all hear. So I'm going to play this one first. I'm going to play it one more time. So as you heard, it sounds garbled, robotic, R2D2-like, correct? And then next, listen to this one.
She cut with her knife.
I'm going to play it one more time.
She cut with her knife.
Okay, let's go back to this one. So, as you may have noticed, after listening or having the experience of the actual sentence as a prior, you can now attribute meaning to the kind of garbled speech. So that kind of functions as a prior that leads to perception. So keeping that in mind as a very simple example of priors, think of situations where such priors in terms of auditory or visual stimuli can lead to abnormal perception where you attribute overly strong, you weigh that prior in an overly strong way and attribute meaning to something that may not be meaningful. All right, so over several years, using multiple different methods, hallucinations have been related to behavior that signals overly strong priors. So there's been, okay. So in terms of the research that I have done on this idea of overly strong priors, there's been a couple different behavioral tasks that get at this. So in clinical as well as non-clinical voice hearers, so people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia who endorse auditory hallucinations, as well as healthy volunteers who endorse hallucinations but are not distressed by them or do not seek treatment for them. So the reason to study people who from the latter group is so that we can isolate the phenomenon of just experiencing hallucinations outside of a diagnosis or stigma or disability. So it offers a new way of looking at just specific groups of symptoms without the diagnosis. So that's just the rationale for using those two samples. But in these samples, we used various tasks across two different sensory modalities, addressing whether overweighting of priors is a kind of pervasive alteration that relates to psychosis proneness across both clinical and non-clinical samples. So in a first task, we used a motion perception task. Hopefully it's clear enough, but the idea here is to examine whether people can update their perception based on new sensory input. So initially, we show them dots at a somewhat noisy level of coherence. When I say noisy coherence, it just means that only a certain % of dots within that aperture are moving in one direction at the same time. So in this case, we use 35%, which means 35% of the dots. So the reason for that is just to kind of somewhat mimic environmental uncertainties in day-to-day life. So we basically showed them those dots moving in one direction at the beginning of the trial. And then the midway through the trial, the dots changed direction, and their task was to report the direction seen at the end of the trial. So in this case, these initial dots, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the initial dots function kind of as the prior of what is there when you're performing the task. And then new input is the change motion, where you have to update your perception based on sensory input. The hypothesis here was that if you have overly strong priors, you would not update as frequently. And in fact, across two different samples at two different sites, we do see that people with schizophrenia are more prone to reporting this initial motion direction than the updating. So on the right, for the most part, both controls, which is on the right part, and patients on the left, for the most part, people are pretty accurate with getting the change direction, but we do see in these boxes that patients are more prone to the initial than controls. So this serves as a very simple perceptual task where we show kind of a failure to update as much as healthy controls do. And so the benefits of such a task is that it's uncontaminated by things like complex cognitive function like probabilities, or kind of making inferences based on strategic calculations. It's a very simple perceptual task that gets at motion perception in lower levels of the visual system as well. So that's one task. And then so we see this kind of failure to update also in the non-clinical sample, which is higher than the control sample. And this index of failure to update or overly strong priors was related to symptoms like reality distortion as well as hallucinations. And this was across both sites and both samples, so pretty good reliability there. And then another task that we use is this hollow mask task. So in this one, we basically study the propensity to a depth illusion using a hollow mask. And a hollow mask has both a concave and a convex side. But when watching a video of this rotating mask, both sides appear to be convex. This is because our brain knows faces to be always convex, and this knowledge is considered to be a very highly reliable prior. So despite sensory input with the rotating mask showing that it's actually a concave face, most subjects tend to report this as pointing outwards because your brain knows a face as a strong prior. So you'll see that, I'm going to stop doing that. I don't want to give anyone a seizure here. You'll see that for the most part, everyone does have a propensity to this illusion, but among the patient group, you'll see that it's a mixed finding based on those who do have hallucinations and those who do not. So in my sample, we see the separation. In the previous literature, this task is more related to disorganized or cognitive symptoms. So basically, we can see some kind of specificity for this idea of a strong prior. So for those who have more of the hallucination flavor of symptoms, there's a bit of a stronger prior, stronger propensity to this illusion. But those in this sample who are not who do not fall to this illusion are more on the disorganized symptoms. So the reason being that there are some cognitive deficits in schizophrenia whereby you're not able to use cognitive control with a top-down perception of things. You kind of perceive lower level bottom up. So for those who do not fall to this illusion, It's the idea that you're just seeing something for what it is in spite of the prior knowledge. So that's where the top-down control cognitive side of things comes into play. Thus, the specificity of the proneness to illusion being more to those on the strong prior side of things versus over attribution to bottom-up input. Hopefully that makes sense, but I can answer questions about that. And then another task we used, we also tested proneness to induced hallucinations in a conditioned hallucinations task, where participants were repeatedly presented with a visual checkerboard stimulus and an auditory tone at the same time. And they were told to detect the tone, which was difficult to hear at times amidst white noise. Eventually, participants reported hearing the tone only when the checkerboard was presented. So as such, they had a conditioned hallucination. But this effect was a lot more pronounced in the two hallucinating groups. So people who endorse hallucinations who are not clinical, as well as the patients who endorse auditory hallucinations. So basically, across these three tasks, we were able to, one, gauge whether the idea of overweighting of strong priors relates to it being manifested in these behavioral tasks, as well as being related to hallucinations, and just kind of getting a composite index of strong prior participants that we could relate to other things in terms of looking at some biological measures as well. And yeah, so as such, the composite score was related to clinical ratings that assess delusions as well as hallucinations, and it was pretty specific to delusions where kind of belief updating is required. So I'm going to take a pause and a break for any questions regarding this overly strong prior framework before I jump into the other framework. All right, I will keep going. So, considering the brain to be kind of an inference machine, just back to the initial idea that led to these two different frameworks, within the sensory motor system, whenever there is a motor plan, so let's say you're reaching for your coffee mug or you're making an eye movement towards an object, whenever there's a plan for that motor act, signals are sent to the actual sensory system that executes the motion. And a copy of that command, known as a corollary discharge, is also sent to predictor organs, predictor nodes in the brain that allow for the receptive areas to know that, hey, I'm about to make this movement or eye movement, or I'm about to speak. So do not respond. This is my own self-generated movement. So basically, the actual sensory feedback, let's say from your hand touching the coffee mug, that's the physical sensory feedback, plus the predicted sensory feedback from the copy of your initial motor command, those two things are matched to decipher whether something was self or externally generated. So based on this kind of sensory motor prediction system, anything that could possibly go awry in this system could lead to sense of agency disturbances or some of the delusional passivity symptoms where you think your thoughts or actions are being controlled by an external agent. So narrowing in on the commonly experienced auditory hallucinations, the way the corollary discharge mechanism functions in this system is that when there is a plan to speak, for example, the signal is sent to the muscles or motor area that is responsible for speech. And a copy of that command is also sent to the auditory cortex to kind of prepare it for the sensory outcome of the speech. So you know that this is my own voice talking. And in patients, an imprecise or malfunctioning CD mechanism could lead to misattribution of their own speech being attributed to external agents. So a simple day-to-day example is for us, we can be having inner speech, which is also subvocal. Signals are sent to your speech areas subvocally. So let's say something like, oh, I should probably do my laundry today. And that's subvocal, you're not actually verbalizing it, but a signal is also sent to your auditory cortex, so you recognize that inner thought as your own. So you can imagine a scenario where with a patient who has an impairment in the system, that inner thought could come across as an auditory hallucination with, oh, someone is giving me a command to do laundry. So that's just how it presents in kind of a day-to-day setting, but there's an intricate mechanism behind that. So evidence of this comes from electrophysiological recordings that are used to measure people's responses to their overt speech, inner speech, as well as played back sound of their own voice while recording that. So basically the idea is that when you have either inner speech or actual vocalization, the signal sent to the auditory cortex kind of instructs it to not respond to the outcome of that speech because it's your own. So what we see is with this mechanism functioning in a healthy way, you see a dampening of activity in the auditory cortex. What we've seen evidence of is that in patients, you don't see this dampening. So that's how we can assay this mechanism kind of being impaired in patients or in people who have hallucinations. And then same idea in the visual system. So whenever there's a plan to make an eye movement towards something, a copy of that command is relayed to the frontal eye fields, the receptive visual area, to kind of inform it that something in the environment is about to change in terms of what you see. And because of this mechanism, you know that it's because your eye moved, not because there's everything shifting around you. So this mechanism in the visual system is not just responsible for the sense of agency in that sense, but also responsible for just stable visual perception in the world around us. And again, this is a mechanism that can be tested in the lab in a very simple perceptual task. So in this task, you have, I'll just quickly go over it. You have an initial target and you're instructed to look towards it. And with technology that we have with eye tracking systems, you can detect that the eye movement started to move. And so what we do is we program the task in a way that as soon as that eye movement is detected, we shift the target either forwards or backwards. And the participants are told to indicate which way the target moved. So in this case, let's see if I have an illustration. Okay, yeah. So in this case, I'm just gonna draw your attention to this box. So in this case, your starting point is the fixation. The red is the initial target, and this is the shifted target location. So we have a visual error there. So just based on kind of the physics and shape of everyone's eyes, we tend to always fall short of a visual target. So basically, this is actually not the example I wanted to show, but let's kind of swap the eye for this for a second, if you can follow. If you think of this as where this black dot as where your eye landed, and this eye is actually the shifted target. if your predictive mechanism was functioning in an intact way, the programmed eye movement would allow you to perceive that that's actually the target right here. And so when you report your perceptual judgment, in spite of where your eye landed, you would know that that target moved backwards. If you did not have that predictive mechanism functioning correctly, you would report that target as being in front of your eye because you're only using the landing position of the eye. So using this very like intricate dynamics of the eye position and the shifted target, we can use measures to assess whether someone's predictive mechanism is functioning as it should. So what we find in patients, I'm going to kind of skip over, there's a lot of stuff going on in the slide, but what we find in patients is that instead of using what would be the predicted trajectory of the eye movement, just based on the copy of the signal, they tend to use the visual landing point to make these judgments. So instead of using the prediction, they're basically using what is in front of them. So similar to what I was saying about the two groups in the hollow mask, just the bottom-up input that they see without using any predictive information. All right, another task that we can see this in, and I'm gonna try wrap up quickly, but another task is a visual motor rotation task. And based on the corollary discharge or comparator model, what we test in this task is the ability to predict the sensory consequences of an arm movement, a visual motor movement. So this is kind of the task setup. So we have an artist's drawing pad, and then it's overlaid with a screen. So it's hiding your actual movements from your view. And so we ask people to make just outward movements, and you see the trajectory overlaid on that screen above. And what we do is we give them false feedback and rotate where they see the feedback because they're not able to see their actual arm movement under the screen. And so again, this is testing whether, given the prediction of your planned movement, are you able to match that with what you see on screen and then correct for the false feedback? So what we see is that in patients, when there is actual visual feedback, they are in fact able to, this is kind of a motor learning and adaptation. So patients are able to kind of adapt to the false feedback when there is a visual signal. When you take away the visual signal and apply it to new settings, you see patients have a lot more spatial decay because they don't have something bottom up or a visual error signal, and the predictive mechanism to apply to new settings is impaired. So as far as the sensory motor system goes, a lot of the measures and tasks that we use are related to the interplay between the input, the visual feedback, and the predictive mechanism. So kind of playing around with these within experimental paradigms, we can get at whether this predictive signal is impaired or not. And of course, in the auditory system, EEG is one of the well-known ways to test that as far as the receptive signal goes. But yeah, those are the three tasks I have conducted to look at this idea of predictive mechanisms. I'm going to skip over those just to tie both perspectives together. So considering that in the initial framework, the predictive coding framework, it seems to be this idea of overly strong priors. Whereas in this latter framework, the corollary discharge framework, it's more characterized by weaker priors or weaker predictions per se. So one of my goals with a current and hopefully bigger future project is to tie these things together and see if they can be reconciled. So one potential reconciliation as far as hallucinations go is kind of reduce signaling at lower levels of the hierarchical processing system can then lead to over-relying on essentially higher order priors. So that's one potential. But what I am interested in more is the specificity of how these mechanisms operate, because this may apply to this idea of the hierarchical processing being a factor, could apply to hallucinations, but not necessarily to psychotic symptoms at large. So what I propose is that within the predictive coding framework, things like delusions of persecution, things like grandiosity or conspiracy beliefs, these could all be perceivably linked to higher order, overly strong priors where you attribute meaning to these things. And in terms of hallucinations, it could be when prior predictions insert overdue influence on inferences. So creating external stimuli when they're creating percepts when there's no external stimuli, as in the conditioned hallucinations example. And same thing with the visual system. And then as far as specificity with the corollary discharge framework, I propose that these are linked more to passivity experiences. So the idea that your thoughts or actions are being influenced by an external agent because your sensory motor system's ability to distinguish between self and externally generated sensory stimuli is impaired. So in that sense, I propose that these two frameworks could be applied to get at very specific mechanisms within clusters of positive symptoms. And some patients may show a mix of both, or it could be that the patients who are exhibiting more of these type of symptoms, the predictive coding framework is more relevant, and that could lead to highly kind of personalized precision treatments for getting at these clusters of symptoms. So based on that, similar tasks to what I talked about, we can test this in the same group of people across this battery of tests that is very much like the examples I gave. So that's kind of me tying those things together and, you know, wrapping up that aspect of how these models could potentially be reconciled or not, and there's more of a specificity issue. But I guess some of the caveats of, in my setting, we use only stable outpatients, so it may not be representative of the full range of psychotic symptoms, so that's a little more difficult to study. And then as far as trying to look at the acute positive symptoms in more severe patients, there could be the issue of them being too disorganized to follow task instructions, and there comes logistical issues with that as well. And then as far as the comparator model, it was developed in the context of motor control processes. And it could not be applied to symptoms that are not related to sensory motor processes, in which case there's the predictive coding framework as well. And I mean, I think one benefit of studying some of these things in a non-clinical population that does report some of these psychotic type symptoms is truly being able to get at, you know, which clusters of these things travel together and what mechanism can explain the pure kind of phenomenology of it. And that's a wrap. I'm going to leave this up for a second. But also, today is Juneteenth, so I would like to recognize and acknowledge that. For people who are not aware, it's a day dedicated to recognize justice and freedom for African Americans and Black people in America. And it was first celebrated in Texas on June 19th, 1866, to commemorate the end of slavery and enslaved people first learning of the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's a great thing that there's more recognition for this holiday in the US and hopefully globally as well. But since we're celebrating that today, I thought it would be good to acknowledge. And as Barack Obama said, it's a celebration of progress. So hopefully we at WWN can kind of contribute to the progress of women and minority women all across the globe as well. So I'll end with that.
Okay, so we already have two hands. Thank you so much, Sonia. That was fantastic.